Welcome to a story that has haunted the mountains of Western Virginia for over a century. Before we begin this journey into the past, I want to ask you to leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Because what we're about to explore happened in a time when America still had truly wild places, corners of the map where civilization's light barely reached. The events I'm about to recount occurred in the autumn of 1908 in the rugged highlands of southwest Virginia, along the border with Kentucky. And despite multiple investigations, countless theories, and the passage of more than 100 years, no one has ever definitively explained what became of Samuel Thorne. Let me take you back to that era. 1908 was a year of transformation in America. Theodore Roosevelt occupied the White House. The first Model T rolled off Ford's assembly line. Cities were electrifying, skyscrapers were rising, and the modern age was beginning to dawn. But not everywhere. In the remote valleys of Appalachia, life proceeded much as it had for generations. The mountains of southwest Virginia, where our story unfolds, remained largely untouched by industrial progress. These were lands of deep hollows and sharp ridges, of communities separated by days of difficult travel, of families who had lived in the same valleys since before the Revolutionary War. The wilderness there was profound. Dense forests of oak, hickory, and chestnut covered slopes so steep that walking them required constant attention. Rhododendron thickets grew so thick they formed impenetrable barriers. Caves riddled the limestone bedrock. Some explored, most not. And in the highest elevations, fog and cloud could descend without warning, turning familiar landscapes into alien territory within minutes. Into this world came Samuel Thorne. Samuel was 28 years old in the fall of 1908. He had grown up in Lynchburg, Virginia, the son of a successful merchant. He'd attended the University of Virginia, where he developed two consuming passions, geology and photography. After graduation, he'd found employment with the United States Geological Survey, a government agency tasked with mapping and studying the nation's natural resources. His assignment that autumn was to conduct a geological survey of Tazewell County and the surrounding highlands. The USGS needed detailed information about mineral deposits, rock formations, water sources, and terrain features for their comprehensive atlas of Virginia. It was exacting work that required both scientific knowledge and physical stamina. Samuel was perfectly suited for it. Colleagues described him as meticulous almost to a fault, a man who filled notebooks with precise observations and measurements. He was also an accomplished photographer, and he brought with him the latest in portable camera equipment, heavy glass plates, a wooden tripod, chemical developing supplies. He intended not just to map the geology, but to document it visually for the survey's records. He was also, by all accounts, sensible and cautious, not the type to take unnecessary risks. That detail becomes important later. Samuel departed from the town of Tazewell on September 15, 1908. He traveled with 2 mules carrying his equipment and supplies for a month in the field. His plan was to work his way southwest along the ridgelines toward the Kentucky border, then loop back north through a different series of valleys. He had arranged for a local man, Caleb Morrison, to serve as his guide for the first week. Caleb was a hunter and trapper who knew the country intimately. The arrangement was that Caleb would show Samuel the main trails and landmarks, help him establish base camps at strategic locations, then return home while Samuel continued the survey work alone. This was standard procedure. Surveyors often worked solo for extended periods. Samuel had done it before in other parts of Virginia without incident. The first week proceeded smoothly. Samuel's field journal, which would later become crucial evidence, describes the routine: wake before dawn, break camp, travel to a new survey point, take measurements, make observations, expose photographic plates, establish evening camp, record the day's findings by lamplight, sleep, repeat. The journal entries from those early days are exactly what you'd expect from a geological survey. Detailed descriptions of rock strata, notes on elevation and water flow, sketches of notable formations. There's nothing unusual, nothing ominous. Caleb Morrison later told investigators that Samuel seemed in excellent spirits during their time together. The weather had been fair, the work was progressing ahead of schedule, and Samuel was excited about several interesting geological features he'd discovered. On September 22nd, as planned, Caleb headed back to town. Samuel continued alone into higher, more remote country. For the next week, Samuel's journal entries remained systematic and scientific. He was exploring a region of particularly rugged terrain, an area known locally as the Devil's Garden, a name that referred to the twisted rock formations and the difficulty of traversing the landscape. He documented unusual limestone caves, springs that emerged from the mountainside, outcroppings of unusual mineral composition. The photographs he developed in his portable darkroom were crisp and clear, showing dramatic landscapes and intriguing geological details. Then on September 30th, the tone of the journal shifts. The entry for September 30th begins normally enough. Samuel describes the weather turning colder, mentions setting up camp near a substantial cave he wanted to explore. Then he writes something that stands out. Discovered evidence of previous habitation in this area. Found remnants of stone structures approximately half a mile from my current position. Construction appears quite old, possibly predating European settlement. Purpose unclear. The stonework is unlike anything I've encountered in this region, more deliberate than typical settler construction, but also more primitive. We'll investigate further tomorrow. This is the first indication that Samuel had stumbled onto something unexpected. The following day's entry is longer and more detailed. Samuel spent October 1st examining the stone structures he'd found. His description is clinical, methodical. He measured them, photographed them, made detailed sketches. The structures appeared to be the remains of small buildings or shelters, arranged in a rough circular pattern in a clearing that showed no signs of recent human activity. What troubled him was the location. The site was at a high elevation, in terrain that would be brutally difficult to access and sustain life in. There was no obvious water source nearby. The growing season would be impossibly short. It made no practical sense as a habitation site. Yet the construction was sophisticated. The stones were carefully selected and fitted. The structures had been built to last. Samuel writes, "I cannot determine who built these structures or when, but their presence here is deeply puzzling. The locals I spoke with before entering this region made no mention of any settlements in this area, current or historical. I wonder if they are even aware these ruins exist." He took multiple photographs of the site. Those images would later be studied intensely by researchers trying to understand what Samuel had discovered. But here's what's strange. When investigators eventually located what they believed was the site Samuel described, based on his field notes and maps, the stone structures were gone. Not decayed or collapsed, gone, as if they had been deliberately dismantled and removed. But I'm getting ahead of the story. After documenting the stone structures, Samuel continued his survey work, moving deeper into the mountain wilderness. His October 2nd entry describes encountering an unusually dense forest of old-growth timber, trees that must have been centuries old. The canopy was so thick that even at midday, the forest floor remained in twilight. He also mentioned something else. "I have the distinct impression of being observed. This feeling has persisted throughout the day. I have seen no one, heard no voices, encountered no signs of other humans. Yet the sensation remains. Perhaps it is merely the isolation playing tricks on my mind, but I find myself constantly scanning the tree line, convinced that eyes are watching from the shadows." This is the first mention of what would become a recurring theme in Samuel's final journal entries. the sense of being watched. Over the next several days, the feeling intensifies. Samuel continues his work, but his writing becomes less focused on geology and more concerned with his growing unease. He describes hearing sounds he cannot identify, not animal sounds, but something else. Rhythmic noises that seem almost like tools striking stone, but distant and difficult to localize. On October 5th, he writes, "Last night I was awakened by what sounded like voices, not close but carried on the wind from somewhere in the valley below. I could not make out words, could not even be certain of the language. The acoustics in these mountains are strange. Sound travels in unpredictable ways, echoing off rock faces, distorting. But I am now certain that there are other people in this region, despite its remoteness and difficulty of access." He considered abandoning the survey and returning to town, but decided against it. He had nearly completed his assigned work and didn't want to leave it unfinished. He reasoned that whoever else was in the mountains was keeping their distance, and as long as that remained true, he could complete his remaining tasks and depart. It was a fateful decision. On October 7th, Samuel discovered a cave system that would become central to the entire mystery. He had been following a stream to its source, hopping to document the hydrology of the region, when he noticed an opening in a cliff face, partially concealed by vegetation. His natural curiosity as a geologist compelled him to investigate. The cave entrance was narrow, but opened into a larger chamber beyond. Samuel lit a magnesium flare for illumination and ventured inside. What he found is described in remarkable detail in his journal. The main chamber was roughly circular, perhaps 40 feet in diameter, with a high ceiling that disappeared into darkness. The walls showed clear signs of water erosion, typical of limestone caves in the region. But there were also signs of human presence. The floor of the cave had been deliberately leveled and covered with flat stones, creating a kind of platform or floor. Around the perimeter, someone had arranged rocks into what Samuel described as cairns or markers of some kind, their purpose unclear. In the center of the chamber was something that particularly drew Samuel's attention, a circular arrangement of stones surrounding what appeared to be the remains of many fires. The ash was old, but the stones showed evidence of repeated, intense heating. Samuel photographed everything. He collected samples of the ash for later analysis. He measured and mapped the chamber, and he discovered something that deeply disturbed him. At the back of the main chamber, a smaller passage led deeper into the mountain. Samuel followed it for approximately 30 feet before it opened into a second chamber. And in that chamber, he found bones. Not animal bones, human bones. Samuel was careful to note that he was not an expert in anatomy or archaeology, but the bones appeared to him to be quite old. They were arranged in a specific pattern that he described as deliberate, possibly ceremonial. He counted what appeared to be the remains of at least 4 individuals. This discovery changed everything. Samuel now understood that he had stumbled onto something far beyond a simple geological survey. This cave had been used for purposes he could only guess at, and those purposes appeared to have included human death. Whether the people had died naturally and been interred there, or whether something more sinister had occurred, Samuel could not determine. But the careful arrangement suggested ritual, practice, tradition. He decided he needed to report this immediately. Whatever scientific value his geological survey had was now overshadowed by what appeared to be an archaeological and possibly forensic discovery of significant importance. He took photographs of the bone chamber, though he later wrote that the images barely captured the unsettling quality of the scene. He collected a few small bone fragments as evidence. Then he exited the cave, intending to break camp and head directly back to Tazewell to alert the authorities. That was October 7, 1908. Samuel Thorne was never seen alive again. The final entries in Samuel's journal are fragmentary, hurried, and increasingly disturbed in tone. October 8th morning, broke camp at first light, intend to travel at maximum speed toward town. The cave discovery has unsettled me more than I care to admit. I have the overwhelming conviction that I should not have entered that place, should not have disturbed what was there. This is not rational thinking, I know. I am a man of science. Yet the feeling persists. October 8th evening. Made poor progress today. The trail I used to enter this region seems to have become difficult to follow. Landmarks I noted on my way in are not where I expect them to be. I may be more disoriented than I realized. The weather is turning bad. Low clouds, cold rain, have established camp. We'll reassess in the morning. October 9th. The rain continues. Visibility is poor. I attempted to continue south but became convinced I was traveling in circles. Returned to this camp. I am low on provisions. The situation is becoming serious. Then there's a gap. No entry for October 10th. October 11th. I am being followed. No longer a vague impression, certain knowledge. I have seen figures moving in the tree line. They do not approach directly but maintain a constant distance. At night I hear movement around my camp. This morning I found that my equipment had been disturbed while I slept, though nothing was taken. I am frightened. I admit it freely. I am frightened. October 12th. Abandoned most equipment, traveling light, moving as quickly as terrain allows, must reach civilization. The followers are more numerous now, or perhaps bolder. I have seen at least 6 distinct individuals. They do not call out, do not communicate. They simply watch and follow. Who are they? What do they want? October 13th morning. Found a shelter overhang, resting briefly. My map and compass were in the pack I discarded. I am navigating by the sun when it's visible, which is rarely. I believe I am heading generally northeast, which should eventually bring me to settled areas. Food is gone. Water is available from streams. I must keep moving. October 13th later. They are closing in. The followers are no longer maintaining their distance. I have seen them clearly now. Men and women both, dressed in clothing that appears handmade, primitive. They move through the forest with absolute silence. I do not believe they mean me well. Tonight I will not sleep. I will move through the darkness, hopping to slip past them. And then the final entry, written in handwriting that is barely legible, the letters jagged and rushed. They have found me, surrounded, no escape. They are not speaking, but I understand what they want. They want me to come with them back to the cave. I think I know what happens there now. God help me. If this journal is found, tell my family. The sentence is unfinished. The journal ends there. When Samuel failed to return to Tazewell by mid-October, his employers at the USGS contacted his family. His father, William Thorne, immediately traveled to Tazewell and organized a search party. The party, consisting of 12 local men familiar with the mountains, departed on October 22nd. They followed Samuel's planned route based on the maps he'd filed before his departure. The autumn weather was worsening. Cold rain mixed with early snow at higher elevations, which made the search difficult. After 4 days of searching, they found Samuel's first campsite, the one he'd shared with Caleb Morrison. From there, they were able to follow his trail by locating subsequent camps, identified by remains of fires and occasional surveying equipment that Samuel had cached for later retrieval. The search party made steady progress through Samuel's route for the first week. They found his survey markers, his camps, even a few of the photographic plates he'd exposed and left in protected locations. Everything suggested a methodical, orderly expedition. But as they moved deeper into the mountains, following Samuel's path, the trail became harder to follow. The survey markers became more sporadic. The camps seemed hastily established and quickly abandoned. On October 30th, the search party found something significant. One of Samuel's mules dead, its body in an advanced state of decay. The animal appeared to have fallen from a steep slope, though whether by accident or because it had been spooked was impossible to determine. Near the dead mule, scattered across a wide area, they found much of Samuel's equipment. His camera smashed, his developing chemicals spilled, his notebooks and reference materials sodden and damaged but still partially readable. They also found something that troubled them, signs that the equipment had not simply been abandoned or lost in an accident, but had been deliberately destroyed. The camera had been repeatedly struck with something heavy. The glass plates containing photographs had been systematically shattered. The notebooks had pages torn out. Someone or something had wanted to destroy Samuel's documentation of what he'd found. The search party continued for 3 more days, finding increasingly disturbing evidence. Articles of Samuel's clothing torn and scattered, his surveying tools bent and broken, and more troubling, signs that Samuel had not been alone in his final days. Multiple sets of footprints in muddy areas, places where many people had clearly been moving through the forest together, evidence of camps that were not Samuel's, different construction, different materials. On November 2nd, the search party found the cave. The cave entrance matched Samuel's description in his recovered field notes. The search party entered cautiously, carrying torches and lanterns. The main chamber was as Samuel had described it, the stone floor, the fire rings, the cairns. But the second chamber, the one where Samuel had found bones, was empty, completely empty. Not just empty of bones, empty of any evidence that bones had ever been there. The floor was swept clean. The walls showed no marks, no disturbances. It was as if Samuel's description of the bone chamber had been fiction. But the search party didn't believe that. Samuel had been too specific, too detailed. His account had the ring of truth. More importantly, they found evidence that the chamber had been recently and thoroughly cleaned. Fresh scratch marks on the stone where someone had scraped the floor. The smell of lime, which could be used to hasten decomposition and eliminate evidence. And most tellingly, a small fragment of cloth caught in a crack in the wall, a cloth that William Thorne immediately identified as matching a shirt he'd given Samuel the previous Christmas. Someone had been here. Someone had cleaned this chamber, and they'd done it recently, possibly after learning that a search party was in the mountains. The searchers also found something that Samuel hadn't mentioned, a passage leading from the bone chamber even deeper into the cave system. They followed it for several hundred feet, descending steadily, before it became too narrow and dangerous to continue without proper spelunking equipment. One of the search party members, a man named Robert Phelps, later reported that as they stood in that deep passage, they heard sounds from far below. Sounds that he described as voices, many voices, echoing up from depths we could not fathom. The search party exited the cave and made camp nearby, intending to continue their investigation in the morning. But that night, something happened that would effectively end the organized search for Samuel Thorne. The search party's camp was attacked. That's the only word for it, attacked. Robert Phelps, who survived and later gave testimony, described it this way. We had posted 2 men on watch as we'd done every night. Around midnight, those men raised the alarm. We were surrounded. I cannot say with certainty how many there were. The darkness was profound and they carried no lights. But there were many, dozens at least. They did not speak. They did not shout or threaten. They simply moved toward our camp in silence, converging from all directions. We could see them only as shadows against shadows, shapes that moved with purpose and coordination. Several of our men fired rifles into the air as warning shots. The figures did not stop. We fired more shots, some aimed low to frighten but not kill. Still they came. Then they were upon us, not attacking with weapons but with their bodies, grabbing at our equipment, our supplies, our very persons. It was not a fight. It was being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. They tore down our tents, scattered our gear, pulled men away from the central fire. I was knocked to the ground, held there by multiple hands. I could not see faces. The night was too dark. but I could feel them, smell them. They smelled of earth and smoke and something else, something I cannot name but that filled me with dread. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. They withdrew into the darkness, taking with them some of our supplies and equipment. 3 of our men were missing. The remaining 9 members of the search party gathered what they could and fled the mountains at first light, not stopping until they reached Tazewell. They were exhausted, terrified, and 3 men short. The missing men were Thomas Hartley, age 43, a farmer; Jacob Klein, age 37, a carpenter; and William Thorne himself, Samuel's father, age 56. A larger search party was organized immediately, this time including law enforcement from the county sheriff's office. But when they reached the area where the attack had occurred, they found nothing. No sign of the camp, no evidence of the struggle, no trace of the 3 missing men. Even the cave entrance, which Robert Phelps insisted he could lead them to directly, could not be found. The landscape seemed to have changed, or perhaps Phelps's memory was distorted by trauma. The larger search party spent a week scouring the area. They found no bodies, no evidence, no clues. It was as if the earth had opened and swallowed everyone involved. The disappearance of Samuel Thorne, and subsequently of his father and 2 other searchers, became a matter of significant public interest. The governor of Virginia ordered an official investigation. The USGS demanded answers. Newspapers across the state covered the story. The investigation was led by a state police detective named Marcus Webb, a man with a reputation for thoroughness and skepticism. He spent 3 months interviewing witnesses, examining evidence, and consulting with experts. Webb's final report, filed in February 1909, is a remarkable document. It runs to over 200 pages and includes detailed analysis of every aspect of the case. But its conclusion is frustratingly vague. After extensive investigation, I can confirm that Samuel Thorne entered the mountains of southwest Virginia in September 1908 and did not return. I can confirm that his equipment and personal effects were found scattered over a wide area in a condition suggesting deliberate destruction. I can confirm that a search party sent to find him was attacked by unknown parties, resulting in the disappearance of 3 additional men. However, I cannot confirm the exact nature of what Samuel Thorne discovered in those mountains, nor can I identify with certainty who attacked the search party. The region in question is vast, rugged, and largely uninhabited. My investigation has revealed that there are likely small, isolated communities in the most remote areas, communities that avoid contact with the outside world, and whose existence is known only through rumor and occasional brief encounters. Whether these communities are connected to the disappearances, I cannot definitively state. What I can say is that the mountains hold secrets, and some of those who live there guard those secrets with a ferocity that should not be underestimated. Webb recommended that no further search parties be sent into the region without significant law enforcement or military support. That recommendation was accepted, but the support was never provided. The case was effectively closed, though officially it remained open, unsolved on the books. In March 1909, 4 months after the search party attack, something extraordinary happened. A package arrived at the USGS office in Washington, D.C. It was addressed simply to the survey and had no return address. The postmark indicated it had been mailed from a small post office in Kentucky, near the Virginia border. Inside were photographic plates, Samuel Thorne's photographic plates. Not all of them, many had been destroyed as the search party had discovered, but 11 plates survived, and they were the most important ones. The images showed the stone structures Samuel had found, the cave entrance, and most significantly, the bone chamber before it had been cleaned. The photographs were exactly as Samuel had described. The bones were visible, arranged in patterns that experts agreed appeared ceremonial. The USGS turned the plates over to anthropologists at the Smithsonian Institution for analysis. The experts were puzzled. The bones appeared ancient, possibly hundreds of years old, but the chamber itself showed signs of recent use. The fires Samuel had noted, for instance, contained wood that had been burned within the past decade, not centuries ago. One anthropologist, Dr. Helena Marsh, published a paper suggesting that the site represented a continuous tradition of ritual practice extending back possibly to pre-Columbian times, maintained by a group that has deliberately remained isolated from modern society. But her paper raised more questions than it answered. Who were these people? How had they remained undetected for so long? Why had they been using the cave, and for what purposes? And why, after Samuel discovered the site, had they sent his photographs to the very institution he worked for? Dr. Marsh speculated that it was a message. We allow you to know we exist. We allow you to see what you discovered. But you may not come here. You may not disturb us further. This is the extent of knowledge we will permit. But that raised another question. If these isolated people wanted to discourage further intrusion, why had they killed or captured Samuel and the searchers? Wouldn't simply threatening them and sending them away have been sufficient? Dr. Marsh had a darker theory. The photographs were sent because those depicted in the bone chamber were not the group's only victims. The bones were evidence of a long practice. Perhaps Samuel Thorne and the others who vanished have now joined those bones, and perhaps, in some dark way, this was the group's manner of documenting their continuation of that ancient practice. It was a deeply unsettling suggestion, and it was not well received by Samuel's remaining family or by the authorities. But Dr. Marsh stood by her analysis. Over the years that followed, there were occasional reports from the region that kept the mystery alive. In 1912, a hunter named Ernest Wade claimed he had encountered a group of strangely dressed people in the mountains while tracking a wounded deer. He described them as wearing handmade clothing and speaking a language he couldn't identify. When they saw him, they melted into the forest without a word. Wade reported the encounter to the sheriff, but declined to lead anyone back to the location, saying he had no desire to see those people again. In 1923, a geological survey team working in a different part of the same mountain range reported finding cave systems with evidence of human habitation. They documented it, photographed it, and filed reports. But when a follow-up team was sent 6 months later to conduct further investigation, they could not locate the caves. The original team stood by their findings but could not explain the discrepancy. In 1931, a woman named Sarah Blackwell came forward with a startling claim. She stated that her grandfather, on his deathbed, had confessed to being part of a mountain clan that lived in complete isolation in the high country. According to him, the clan had existed for longer than memory, maintaining old ways and old beliefs. He claimed they had dealt with outsiders who discovered their settlements on several occasions throughout history. He mentioned Samuel Thorne by name, saying that surveyor saw too much and had to be brought into the mountain. Sarah Blackwell's statement was investigated, but her grandfather had died, and no one could corroborate his claims. She herself knew nothing more. He had told her only that one story, only that one time, and had forbidden her from ever speaking of it until after his death. They had been surveying for a new road when they discovered a settlement of about 20 buildings in a remote valley. The buildings were primitive but well-maintained. Gardens showed recent cultivation, but there were no people anywhere in sight. The crew left to report the discovery and returned 2 days later with officials from the state. The settlement was gone. Not abandoned, gone. The buildings had been dismantled, the gardens torn up, even the paths had been obscured. It was as if the crew had imagined the whole thing, except that all 6 men told the same story and none had any reason to fabricate such a tale. In 1966, the area where Samuel Thorne had disappeared was included in a newly established national forest. Rangers began regular patrols, and the land became more accessible to hikers and campers. Interestingly, after the national forest was created, reports of unusual encounters in the region declined sharply. It's as if whatever presence had been in those mountains had finally moved on, dispersed, or ceased to exist. Or perhaps, as some have suggested, they simply moved deeper into the wilderness, to areas that remained roadless and unpatrolled. In recent decades, amateur historians and mystery enthusiasts have periodically attempted to solve the Samuel Thorne case using modern technology and techniques. In 1983, a researcher named Donald Pierce used Samuel's surviving field notes and maps to attempt to locate the exact cave system where the bone chamber had been. He spent 2 summers searching the area with a team of volunteers. They found several caves that matched some elements of Samuel's description, but none that matched all of them. In one cave, they found old fire rings similar to what Samuel had described. In another, they found limestone formations that matched his geological sketches, but they never found a cave that had both the main ceremonial chamber and the deeper bone chamber. Pierce concluded that either Samuel's notes were not as accurate as believed, or the cave system had been deliberately altered or concealed after his disappearance. In 1995, a more ambitious project was undertaken. A documentary film crew, working with anthropologists and local historians, attempted to find evidence of isolated communities still living in the mountains. They spent 3 months in the region, interviewing longtime residents, hiking remote areas, and using drone cameras to scout inaccessible valleys. They found nothing definitive. A few elderly locals told stories of the old ones in the high places, but these stories were vague and often contradictory. No one would agree to guide the researchers to specific locations. The documentary team did note something interesting: an unusual reluctance among locals to discuss certain valleys and ridge lines. When asked about specific areas, people would often change the subject or claim not to know the region being discussed, even though their knowledge of surrounding areas was extensive. It was as if certain parts of the mountains were understood to be off-limits, not by law but by unspoken community agreement. The documentary was eventually completed and aired on a cable network in 1997. It presented the mystery of Samuel Thorne and other disappearances in the region, but offered no solutions, only speculation. In 2008, on the 100th anniversary of Samuel's disappearance, a commemorative event was held in Tazewell. His surviving relatives, great-nieces and great-nephews, attended. A historical marker was placed near the courthouse, honoring Samuel's contribution to geological science and acknowledging the mystery of his fate. At that event, something unexpected occurred. An elderly man approached one of Samuel's descendants and handed her an envelope. Inside was a single photograph, a modern photograph in color showing a gravestone. The stone was rough, unmarked except for the initials SD and the year 1908. The man said only, "He rests in the mountains he loved," and walked away before he could be questioned. Attempts to find him afterward were unsuccessful. No one at the event remembered seeing him before or knew his name. The photograph showed only the gravestone against a background of forest. There were no identifying landmarks that would allow the location to be determined. Analysis of the image confirmed it was genuine, not digitally manipulated, and had been taken with a camera manufactured in the early 2000s. Samuel's relatives chose to take the photograph as a form of closure. Whether the grave was real, whether it actually contained Samuel's remains, they would never know. But perhaps the mystery had finally been laid to rest, even if his body's exact location remained unknown. More than a century has passed since Samuel Thorne walked into the Virginia mountains and never returned. In that time, the world has transformed beyond anything he could have imagined. The wild places he explored have been mapped by satellites, photographed from space, analyzed with technologies that would seem like magic to someone from 1908. And yet the central mystery remains unsolved. What did Samuel Thorne actually discover in that cave? Who were the people who followed him through the forest? What happened to him, to his father, and to the other searchers who vanished trying to find him? Were they killed? Were they taken captive? Did they die of exposure and accident with their bodies never recovered? Or did something even stranger occur, something that defies conventional explanation? The evidence we have is fragmentary. A diary with disturbing final entries, photographs that show unexplained sights, testimony from traumatized witnesses, and decades of strange reports from the same region. What can we conclude? First, it seems clear that Samuel did discover something in those mountains, something that others wanted to keep hidden. The stone structures, the cave, the bone chamber, these were real. The photographs prove it. The physical evidence found by search parties confirms it. Second, there were people living in isolation in that region, people who were willing to use violence to protect their privacy and their secrets. Whether they were remnants of some ancient group, or religious separatists, or simply individuals who had rejected modern society, we cannot know for certain. But they existed. Third, the authorities in 1908 and subsequent years made a deliberate decision not to pursue the case aggressively. This may have been pragmatic. The cost and difficulty of forcing contact with isolated mountain communities might have been deemed too great. Or it may have been political. Perhaps influential people wanted certain areas left undisturbed for reasons that were never made public. What we're left with is a mystery that touches on fundamental questions about what we know and what remains unknown, even in a modern, connected, mapped world. As recently as the early 20th century, there were still blank spaces on the American map, still communities living completely outside the reach of government and society, still places where ancient practices continued undisturbed. Perhaps that's not as surprising as it seems. Even today, with all our technology, there are vast wilderness areas in North America, millions of acres of roadless forest, mountain ranges where humans rarely venture. It's not impossible to imagine that small groups, if sufficiently determined, could maintain isolation even in the modern era. The question is, would they want to, and if so, why? What could be so important, so sacred, or so terrible that people would choose absolute isolation, would attack and perhaps kill those who came too close, would maintain their separation for generations? We may never know the answer. The story of Samuel Thorne is, at its heart, a story about boundaries. The boundary between civilization and wilderness. The boundary between known and unknown. The boundary between scientific inquiry and respect for mysteries we perhaps should not probe. Samuel was a man of his time, an era when science and rationalism were conquering the world, when mapping and measurement and understanding seemed capable of illuminating every corner of the earth. He believed that with the right tools and sufficient dedication, any mystery could be solved. But he discovered that some mysteries resist solution. Some places resist mapping. Some secrets are kept by people who will do anything, to maintain them. His fate reminds us that the world is larger and stranger than we often acknowledge, that the past is not as distant as we might assume, and that there are still things beyond our understanding. The mountains where Samuel Thorne vanished still stand. The forests still grow dense and dark on their slopes. The caves still burrow deep into the limestone bedrock, and somewhere in those heights, perhaps, the truth still waits. Whether we should seek it is another question entirely. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of America's most enduring mysteries. If you found this story compelling, if it raised questions you want to explore further, I encourage you to share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe isolated communities could still exist in America's wilderness? Do you think Samuel Thorne's fate will ever be conclusively determined? Subscribe to this channel to explore more historical mysteries, more stories that time has tried to erase, but that still echo in the forgotten places of our world. Until next time, remember, the past is not always as distant as it seems, and some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved.